Like everybody else who's learning jazz, you're trying to improvise solos and you're finding that they're sounding mechanical or kind of robotic because you can choose to play either the arpeggio or the scale, but it's still kind of a boring solo. In this video, I'm going to go over 4 different ways that you can start with the arpeggio and then combine it with a lot of other things that you're probably already practicing, and that way make some really great sounding lines and improve your solos quite a lot. So really, with these techniques you can take any chord that you want and then use diatonic arpeggios to create lines on it. My name is Jens Larsen. Learn jazz, make music. Let's first look at a simple way to learn and understand the arpeggios in the context of a scale, and then I'll get into how you can use this to make lines. When you look at jazz lines in general, then we're not using arpeggios in several octaves. So we're not playing entire positions, which are often more than 2 octaves. So we're only playing smaller melodies, and they're usually within the octave. And that means that that's also how we want to practice the arpeggios. So a great way to practice them is to play them not as positions, but as a scale exercise. So if we take this C major scale, and then for this position of the C major scale, we can play all the diatonic arpeggios as an exercise. That's this. Of course, you should also practice your arpeggios in positions. It's something that we use really a lot, so it's important to check it out in as many ways as you can. But at the same time, for me, when I was really starting out and trying to get used to making jazz lines, it was really a lot more useful to practice the arpeggios in the scale, because in that way I'm really combining 2 of the main things that I need to use when I'm improvising, namely the chord, so the arpeggio of that chord that I'm playing over, but also the scale that I'm using to improvise over that chord. And that's a really important connection to have if you want to play solid jazz lines. I have another video where I'm talking more about practicing arpeggios in a scale context like this, and I'll link to that in the description of this video. Now we have the basics covered, and you have something that you can practice to know the arpeggios and know the scale, and also that really ties those 2 together. So then let's start working on some lines. The easiest way to create strong melodies with arpeggios is to take the arpeggio and then add scale notes in between the arpeggio notes or the chord tones. This way of making melodies is in fact pretty much a description of the melodies of all jazz standards. So if we do that on a C major 7, so I'm going to take a C major 7 arpeggio like this one, and then I'm going to add some scale notes in between, and then I can make lines like this. Here I'm essentially just playing the C major 7 arpeggio and then adding scale notes in 2 places. So we have this arpeggio, and then I'm first adding a D between the C and the E, so, and then up the rest of the arpeggio, so G and B, skipping down to the G again, and then with adding an A, and then ending on the major 7, the B. Here I'm starting on the E, and then first going down to the C again, but adding the D in between, so, and then back up the arpeggio, so E and G, the 3rd and the 5th, and then I'm adding the A to go up to the last note of the arpeggio, the B, and then ending on the 5th, the G. The way you should practice this is first to be able to play the exercise, so the diatonic arpeggios, and so on and so forth, and then take a chord that you want to improvise on, so maybe something that's in a song that you already know, and then take that arpeggio and practice just coming up with lines, mixing the arpeggio and the scale notes, getting used to how that works and using composition as a slow way of practicing improvisation. When we're working with these arpeggios that are all 1 octave and just 4 notes, then it's a lot easier to practice being a little bit more flexible with them, and we can in that way get a lot more out of how we're using them, to just change the order of the notes and in that way create new melodies. If you take a D minor 7 arpeggio like this one, then we can play that in a lot of different ways. That could be something like this. Of course, there are more combinations than this, but there are just a few and they all sound pretty good. And you can work with this. You can also try and take one of these and take that through the scale. And you can also make some lines with it using the arpeggios and this pattern of the arpeggio, and then also mixing in some scale notes. That sounds like this. So here I'm using this pattern where I'm starting on the third of the arpeggio, so the F, going down to the root, and then skipping up to the fifth. And this is a really easy way to just add some larger intervals into your playing and change things up quite a lot. And that's really something that you will hear a lot with beginners when they're starting to improvise jazz solos, that they will only play like scale movement or arpeggio movement, and there are only sort of stepwise motion or maybe a third here and there in their melodies, and we're missing all those larger intervals. And this is really helping with that. So we already get this fifth interval, then skipping up to the C. So now we had the whole arpeggio, and then a scale run from G, and then actually down to E, but I'm adding the D in between, so. This example is using the arpeggio pattern, but I'm also adding a scale note in between some of the chord tones. So the pattern that I'm using is this one starting from the fifth, and then I'm adding an E between the F and the D. So we have, and then I'm skipping back up to the fifth, and then down the scale, ending on the F. Chromaticism is a huge part of the jazz sound. The way that we're using chromatic passing notes and enclosures is something that I actually have a lot of videos on. I'll link to a playlist in the description of this video, and I'm only going to use a really simple version of that in this video, because otherwise it's going to be 4 hours long. So I'm going to take a G7 arpeggio, like this one, and then add a chromatic leading note under each of those chord tones. That sounds like this. And just using this really simple technique, we can already make some really great sounding lines like this one. Here I'm essentially just playing the G7 arpeggio, and then I'm adding 2 chromatic leading notes like this. So first just the G, then a leading note up to the third, so the A sharp into the B, and a leading note to the fifth, up to the seventh, and then down to the 13, the E, and then adding another leading note to the fifth where I'm ending the line. This example is already creating sort of almost a bluesy effect, because I'm starting with a leading note to the third, so, and then down to the root. So here I'm using an arpeggio pattern and then also adding the leading notes. So we have the arpeggio pattern that's third, root, fifth, seventh, and then the leading note. And then I'm adding this kind of bluesy ending, which is really just a scale run and a leading note to the third, and then ending on the third B. Another important melodic technique in bebop is octave displacement. So what happens here is that if you have a melody that's just moving in one direction, then you can take a part of that melody and then move it an octave. Especially for arpeggios, this works really well. If I have a C major 7 arpeggio, like this, then I can take the first note and move that up an octave, like this, and then play the rest of the arpeggio. And that way I'm really introducing this large interval from C down to E, and that's a great way of getting some larger intervals into your playing, and it's really gonna make your lines pop a lot better and sound more varied than just moving in stepwise motion and thirds all the time. In this exercise, I am using the C major 7 arpeggio in the entire position, so that would be this. And I think if you already practiced the arpeggios, so the diatonic arpeggios in the scale, then you will also see how you're already sort of connecting this entire position with the scale position a lot more, and seeing the notes that are around it and knowing that you can use those when you're improvising. And that's going to help you a lot once you start working with this position and checking out the octave displacement exercise or the inversions or other patterns within that arpeggio. This lick is using one of the most famous octave displacement techniques or melodies that we have, because it's actually using the first example that I went over. So I'm starting on the C here, which is an octave displacement of this low C. Then I'm playing the rest of the arpeggio. And this is often referred to as the the Honeysuckle Rose arpeggio, which is of course of that song Honeysuckle Rose. And I'm using it here, and then moving into a scale run, and then ending the line on the 9th of the C major 7 chord. Of course, you can also add chromaticism to these inversions. And here I'm using an inversion, but I'm not using octave displacement. So I'm using a C major 7 arpeggio from the 3rd, so this arpeggio, and then I'm adding a leading note for the first note, the E. So I'm adding this D sharp, so. And then going down the scale, but adding a chromatic leading note between the B flat and the A, and then ending on the 5th, the G. When you're working with these techniques, then I think a big part of getting it into your playing is to sit down and really try and compose lines with them, and in that way explore what it sounds like and figure out how you can use it in a way that you like. Another thing that's also really useful is that if you have transcriptions of solos that you like, then sit down and try to analyze them, try to recognize when all these things are used, and see if you can take over those and remember which ones you like and try to get those into your playing. I think that's a really efficient way of getting more out of the things that you transcribe, or maybe also just the transcriptions you come across online. For most of us, the way that we define the sound of jazz is really the sound of bebop. And if you want to check out a video where I'm going over some bebop phrases and using those to really tell you what makes that sound like jazz and how you can use that in your own playing, then check out this video. See you next week.